Good evening, everyone. Please settle into your favorite armchair, perhaps with a cup of tea, and let the quiet hum of the modern world fade away. Tonight, we will journey back in time to an era of gaslight and gossip, of quaint gardens and whispered secrets, where even the most ordinary village green could hide a tangle of hidden motives and human frailties. In those days, a sharp eye and a deep understanding of human nature were often more potent than any detective's magnifying glass. We find ourselves in St. Mary Mead, a place where, fortunately for us, extraordinary wisdom resided in the most unassuming of figures. Now let's start with the first chapter of The Last Lodger. Chapter 1. The Arrival at Lilac Cottage. St. Mary Mead, in the nascent years of the 20th century, was a village whose rhythm was dictated by the seasons and the church bells, a place where change arrived with the slow, deliberate pace of a well-behaved guest. Life proceeded much as it had for generations, an agreeable tapestry woven with threads of daily routines, polite calls, and the gentle murmur of village gossip. Miss Jane Marple, a lady whose keen mind belied her soft white curls and demure demeanor, was one of its most cherished and, indeed, most discerning inhabitants. From her drawing-room window at Danemead, she observed the world with an acuity that often startled those who mistook her for a simple, elderly maiden. One crisp October afternoon, a motor car, a rarity in these parts, rattled down the lane and paused before Lilac Cottage, a charming but modest dwelling on the outskirts of the village. It was the home of Mrs. Elms, a widow of comfortable means, but a practical turn of mind who occasionally let a spare room to respectable lodgers. Miss Marple, engaged in the delicate task of pruning her prize-winning rambler roses, paused, secateurs momentarily forgotten. She had, through years of observation, developed an almost prescient understanding of the village's subtle currents. The arrival of a new lodger, though not unheard of, always presented a fresh narrative thread. A gentleman alighted from the motor car, overseeing the unloading of two rather small suitcases. He was of medium height, perhaps in his early 40s, with neat, sand-colored hair and spectacles perched on a somewhat aquiline nose. His attire, though of good quality, was nondescript, a tweed suit, a sensible felt hat. He carried himself with an air of quiet self-possession, polite but reserved, as he exchanged pleasantries with Mrs. Elms, who fluttered at the gate, her apron strings askew in her excitement. A Mr. Julian Thorne, Miss Marple, Mrs. Elms had confided, later that day during an impromptu visit, to borrow a cup of sugar. Such a quiet, respectable gentleman. Says he's a scholar come to the country for peace and quiet, to work on his, well, he said, studies. No fuss, no bother. Paid a month in advance, too. Mrs. Elms beamed, clearly delighted with her new acquisition. Miss Marple listened, nodding sympathetically, her eyes, however, betraying a flicker of deeper thought. Indeed, Mrs. Elms, it is a blessing to find such a suitable tenant. But as she spoke, a tiny, almost imperceptible detail nudged at her consciousness. The gentleman's luggage, though perfectly adequate for a short visit, seemed rather sparse for a scholar embarking on an indefinite period of studies. Scholars, in Miss Marple's experience, often traveled with an impressive retinue of books and papers. Mr. Thorne had only 2 cases and a modest leather satchel. Moreover, she had noted the way Mr. Thorne's gaze had swept the surrounding cottages and gardens upon his arrival. Not with the open curiosity of a newcomer admiring the scenery, but with a certain swift, almost appraising thoroughness. It was a glance that suggested not appreciation, but evaluation, like a careful prospector assessing a new site, rather than a weary traveler finding repose. Later, as the twilight settled over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows from the ancient yew trees, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting needles clicking softly. Lilac Cottage, now a warm square of lamplight in the encroaching gloom, seemed to hum with the ordinary domesticity of a new lodger settling in. Yet within Miss Marple a faint, unidentifiable discord vibrated, like a single wrong note struck in a familiar, comforting melody. It was too soon to articulate, too subtle to express, but it was there, a quiet whisper of unease in the serene heart of the village. Chapter 2. A Gentleman of Habits. The days that followed Mr. Julian Thorne's arrival at Lilac Cottage unfolded with the predictable rhythm of St. Mary Mead. Yet within that rhythm small, distinct variations began to manifest, observed by the keen eyes of its residents. Mr. Thorne, true to Mrs. Elms's initial assessment, was indeed a quiet man. His routine was precise, almost meticulously so. He rose early, took a brisk walk along the lane, dined sparingly, and spent most of his afternoons closeted in his room, presumably engaged in his scholarly pursuits. In the evenings he would sit in Mrs. Elms's small parlor, reading from a book he seemed to carry everywhere, a rather old-fashioned volume bound in dark leather. Villagers, encountering him on his morning constitutional, found him unfailingly polite, a man of few words but always a courteous nod or a brief pleasantry. A very private gentleman, declared Mrs. Elms's neighbor, Mrs. Price, over the garden fence. Keeps himself to himself, which, honestly, is a blessing. Not like that last one, always borrowing the newspaper and leaving crumbs. Miss Marple, however, noted the curious lack of engagement in his politeness. It was a well-practiced courtesy, like a protective veneer, rather than a genuine warmth. His eyes, though they met yours, seemed to hold a distant, almost calculating air. He observed, Miss Marple felt, more than he participated. Mrs. Elms, initially delighted, found herself relaying a few, almost comical peculiarities to Miss Marple during their usual village encounters. "He always closes the parlor curtains precisely at dusk, Miss Marple," she'd confided one afternoon. "Even if it's still quite light outside, at the first hint of twilight, he's up and drawing them. And he never asks for a fire, not even on these chilly evenings. Says he prefers the crispness. Most unusual for a man of his age. Then there was the window in his room, always slightly ajar, Miss Marple," Mrs. Elms chuckled, "even in the rain. I went to shut it one morning, fearing a draught, but he politely insisted it remained open, for fresh air, he said." It was a small detail, easily dismissed as an eccentricity, but Miss Marple filed it away. Fresh air in late October in Orish, an English village, could often be rather bracing. Another point of quiet discussion in the village was Mr. Thorne's utter lack of mail. Days turned into a week, then 2, and the postman, Mr. Hemlock, a fount of local information, confirmed that not a single letter or postcard had been addressed to Lilac Cottage for Mr. Thorne. For a man engaged in studies, this seemed rather peculiar. No correspondence with fellow scholars, no research materials. It suggested an isolation that was either extreme or perhaps deliberately maintained. Miss Marple, through her unobtrusive observation, began to piece together a subtle mosaic. A scholar without books, a man without mail, a polite smile that reached only his lips, and a window persistently open, come what may. These were not red flags, not yet, but rather faint smudges upon the pristine canvas of village life. One afternoon, Mrs. Elms hurried over to Danamead, a faint flush on her cheeks. "Miss Marple, I do apologize for disturbing you, but you are such a sensible woman." She wrung her hands. "I was cleaning Mr. Thorne's room today, just tidying up a little, and I found this in the grate." She held out a small, charred scrap of paper. "It's a photograph, or what's left of one. Burned it so completely, he did. Just old rubbish, I suppose, but I couldn't help but wonder." Miss Marple took the scrap. It was indeed a fragment, blurred by the flames, but she could discern the outline of a woman's face, or rather, part of it. The remaining edge showed a faint floral pattern, possibly on a dress or a hat. Perhaps an old memento he no longer wished to keep, Miss Marple suggested gently, handing it back. But as Mrs. Elms moved to discard it, Miss Marple's eyes had caught something else on the burnt fragment, a tiny, almost microscopic tear on the photograph's edge, not from burning, but from being ripped, perhaps hastily, from a larger hole. The old rubbish suddenly felt a good deal less innocent. Chapter 3. A Quaint Enigma. The library, a quaint little building nestled beside the village hall, was another barometer of St. Mary Mead's intellectual currents. Mr. Thorne had, as per Mrs. Elms's proud announcement, applied for a library card. Yet the librarian, a kindly but observant woman named Miss Prescott, mentioned to Miss Marple during a charity tea that Mr. Thorne had never actually borrowed a single book. He would occasionally browse, she recounted, sometimes lingering in the local history section, but always left empty-handed. For a scholar seeking peace for his studies, this was another curious anomaly. What kind of scholar required no books? Miss Marple, during her own measured strolls through the village, frequently observed Mr. Thorne. He was often seen walking past Mr. Hemmings's antique shop, a treasure trove of forgotten heirlooms and polished curiosities. He would pause, Miss Marple noticed, not to admire the displays of ornate silver or gleaming porcelain, but to peer intently at a specific corner of the window, where an assortment of old maps and local ephemera were often displayed. His gaze seemed to bore into them, as if seeking not beauty, but information. The quietude surrounding Mr. Thorne, initially deemed a blessing, began to acquire a different quality. It was not the peaceful solitude of a man engrossed in thought, but a deliberate reticence, a careful withholding. He was like a closed book in a village full of open narratives. Then came the news of Mrs. Elms's missing brooch. It was a family heirloom, a delicate filigree piece set with a small cabochon amethyst, passed down through generations. Mrs. Elms was utterly distraught. It was on my dressing table, Miss Marple, just last week. And now, gone. Her voice trembled with distress. She was reluctant to voice her suspicions, but her eyes, darting towards the parlor door, spoke volumes. Could Mr. Thorne, her respectable lodger, be capable of such a thing? The thought was clearly agony to her. Miss Marple listened with a sympathetic ear, offering comforting words. "Are you quite certain, dear Mrs. Elms, that you haven't simply misplaced it? Perhaps it fell behind a drawer? I've turned the house upside down, Miss Marple. Every nook and cranny, it simply vanished." She wrung her hands. "And Mr. Thorne, he just sits there so calm. He never even mentioned it when I was rummaging about, quite openly, searching for it." The lack of reaction from Mr. Thorne, Miss Marple reflected, was indeed striking. Most people, upon learning of a valuable item missing from a house they inhabited, would at least offer a word of concern, or even a token offer to help search. Mr. Thorne's undisturbed composure was unnerving. It was as if the incident held no relevance to him, or, more troubling, as if he already knew its resolution. Miss Marple's intuitive sense, honed by years of observing human nature, began to weave these disparate threads into a nascent pattern. The sparse luggage, the unread books, the lack of mail, the open window, the half-burnt photograph, the intense scrutiny of old maps, and now the missing brooch and the lodger's stony silence. Each detail, small on its own when placed beside the others, began to suggest a figure not of scholarly repose, but of veiled purpose. One afternoon, as Miss Marple was returning from a particularly fruitful expedition to the vicarage for some cuttings, she saw Mr. Thorne emerging from Mr. Hemmings's antique shop. He walked with his usual measured pace, but as he reached the corner he paused for a fraction of a second. His hand, as if by instinct, slipped quickly into his coat pocket. Miss Marple, from across the street, caught the briefest glimpse of a small, dark object before it disappeared from view. He then quickened his step almost imperceptibly, turning the corner and vanishing from sight. The moment was fleeting, easily missed. Yet, to Miss Marple, it glowed with a sudden, sharp significance, a puzzle piece that had just perhaps found its neighboring edge. Chapter 4. The Vanishing Act. The morning began like any other in St. Mary Mead, bathed in the soft autumnal light. But by mid-morning, a tremor, unlike any caused by a rattling motor car or a sudden gust of wind, passed through the village. Mrs. Elms, her face a pallid mask of distress, stood on her doorstep, wringing her hands as P.C. Hemlock, the local constable, listened with a mixture of professional patience and personal bafflement. Mr. Julian Thorne, the quiet, scholarly lodger, had vanished. "He's simply gone, Constable," Mrs. Elms exclaimed, her voice thin with a mixture of fear and bewilderment. "His bed wasn't slept in. The room is tidy just as he left it yesterday evening. All his things are still there, his 2 suitcases, that leather satchel, his books. He even paid this month's rent in advance, as always. But no note, no explanation, just an empty room." P.C. Hemlock, a man whose experience ran more to stray cows and garden gate disputes than mysterious disappearances, conducted a perfunctory search of the cottage. He examined the room, noted the undisturbed bed, the clothes neatly folded in the dresser. He peered under the bed, opened the small wardrobe, and even checked the coal scuttle. "Everything seems in order, Mrs. Elms," he declared, his brow furrowed. "Are you sure he didn't just pop out early for a walk, perhaps to catch a train from the next village?" "But he never took an early train," Mrs. Elms protested, on the verge of tears. "He always had his breakfast here. And he wouldn't leave without a word, Constable. He's such a polite gentleman." Her voice trailed off, the irony of her own words hanging in the air. A polite gentleman who simply vanished? The news spread through the village like wildfire, carried by the wind. Conversations in the butcher's shop hushed, then erupted into speculation. Some immediately suspected foul play, imagining shadowy figures in the night. Others, more pragmatically, suggested he had merely decamped, perhaps burdened by some unforeseen trouble, preferring to slip away unnoticed. Miss Marple, receiving a slightly breathless account from her maid, Cherry, listened intently. The threads she had been gathering now took on a sharper, more urgent significance. The sparse luggage, the unread books, the lack of mail, the open window. They had pointed to a man who lived without leaving a significant trace, and now he had, quite literally, done so. P.C. Hemlock, after his initial investigation, called for reinforcements from the nearest town. He was convinced, he declared to the gathering villagers on the lane, that it was a simple departure. Probably a man with a past, Mrs. Elms, he surmised, who decided to cut his ties. Happens more often than you'd think. But Mrs. Elms, despite her initial distress, clung to one detail with surprising tenacity. But he wouldn't leave his precious traveling clock, Constable. It was a gift from his mother, he told me. He kept it by his bedside, wound it every night. It's still there, on his nightstand, stopped at 3 minutes past 12. Her voice held a note of genuine conviction. Such a personal, sentimental item left behind. It didn't fit the narrative of a man simply choosing to disappear. Miss Marple, her face serene but her mind working furiously, made her way to Lilac Cottage. Mrs. Elms, grateful for her calming presence, allowed her into Mr. Thorne's now eerily quiet room. Miss Marple's gentle eyes swept over the scene, taking in the neatness, the untouched possessions. She moved slowly, her attention drawn to the small details. The stopped clock, indeed, resting on the bedside table, the 2 suitcases stacked against the wall, the dark leather-bound book, now closed, on a small writing desk. Her gaze finally settled on the rug beside the bed. It was a floral pattern, faded with age. And there, almost imperceptible against the muted colors, she saw it, a small dark stain no bigger than a shilling, partially obscured by the shadow of the bed frame. It was not a fresh stain, but neither was it ancient. It looked recent. P.C. Hemlock had clearly missed it, dismissing the room as undisturbed, but Miss Marple, with her extraordinary eye for the telling detail, knew better. It was a blemish on the otherwise perfect tableau, a small dark question mark in the heart of the empty room. Chapter 5. The Stain and the Secret. P.C. Hemlock, when subtly prompted by Mrs. Elms, returned to Mr. Thorne's room at Miss Marple's unspoken suggestion, though he grumbled good-naturedly about old maids seeing things. He squinted at the small stain Miss Marple indicated. "Tea. Miss Marple, most likely," he pronounced, dismissing it with a wave of his hand. "Or perhaps a smudge of ink. Nothing to trouble ourselves with." He stooped, gave it a perfunctory sniff, and stood up again, satisfied. But Miss Marple was not so easily dissuaded. Later that day, during a quiet moment when Mrs. Elms was distracted with lunch preparations, Miss Marple returned to the room with a small, clean handkerchief. With a discreet dab, she absorbed a tiny portion of the stain. The faint metallic scent she detected, subtle as it was, certainly wasn't tea or ink. She carefully folded the handkerchief, tucking it away in her handbag. The disappearance deemed too perplexing for P.C. Hemlock's limited resources, soon attracted the attention of Inspector Craddock from the county constabulary. A more formidable figure, Craddock arrived with an air of professional gravity, his keen eyes missing nothing. He interviewed Mrs. Elms at length, then spoke to various villagers, including Miss Marple. He found her observations surprisingly pertinent, though he couldn't quite place the source of her remarkable intuition. The inspector's interviews revealed a consistent picture. Mr. Thorne was a man without visible connections. No friends, no family mentioned, no letters, no visitors. He appeared to have materialized in St. Mary Mead from thin air, an enigma. This fellow, Craddock mused to Miss Marple during a brief consultation. He lived like a phantom, Miss Marple. No past, no present, just a polite smile and a quiet room. Miss Marple, observing the inspector's methodical approach, offered a quiet insight. "Sometimes, Inspector, the absence of detail is itself a detail. A man who takes such pains to leave no trace, to be entirely unremarkable, is often hiding something quite remarkable indeed." She recalled the excessive, almost performative politeness of Mr. Thorne. It was a mask, carefully crafted, designed to blend in, to divert attention. It was the courtesy of a man with a secret, not the natural amiability of one with nothing to conceal. She thought of a young curate who had come to the village years ago, so impeccably virtuous, so unnervingly kind, only to abscond with the church funds. Human nature, in all its guises, had a way of repeating itself. The inspector, though initially skeptical of such psychological musings, found himself considering her words. The lack of a clear motive for departure was unsettling. If Thorne had been escaping debt or a scandal, he would surely have taken his few precious belongings. If it was an accident, there would be a body, but there was nothing. Only an empty room and a growing sense of unease. The police conducted a more thorough search of the cottage and its environs. Every drawer was opened, every book examined. The garden was meticulously scoured. Nothing. It was as if Mr. Thorne had simply ceased to exist. Then, late that afternoon, Inspector Craddock called a small meeting at Lilac Cottage. Mrs. Elms, Miss Marple, and P.C. Hemlock gathered in the parlor, the air thick with anticipation. The inspector's face was grim. "We have made a discovery, Mrs. Elms," Craddock began, his voice devoid of its usual clipped efficiency, or rather, a lack of one. "Mr. Thorne's identity papers, his birth certificate, his bank statements, everything we found in his satchel appears to be forged." He held up a document. "This Julian Thorne is not who he claims to be. The real Julian Thorne, we've ascertained, died in infancy some 40 years ago. The man who resided here was an impostor." A collective gasp filled the small room. Mrs. Elms sank onto the sofa, her hand flying to her mouth. P.C. Hemlock's jaw dropped. The mystery had just deepened, twisting into a more sinister form. The search for a missing person had just become a search for an unknown person, a shadow with a carefully constructed past. And in Miss Marple's mind, the faint metallic smell from the stain on the rug now acquired a chilling new context. Chapter 6. A Web of Falsehoods. The revelation of Mr. Thorne's forged identity sent a ripple of shock through St. Mary Mead. The quiet, polite scholar had been a fabrication, a carefully constructed illusion. The village, initially perplexed by his disappearance, now buzzed with renewed and often wild speculation. Who was he, really? And why had he gone to such lengths to assume a false identity in their peaceful village? Miss Marple found herself contemplating the psychology of such deception. A man who invents a new persona must pay meticulous attention to detail, yet often overlooks the most seemingly insignificant elements. For it is these small inconsistencies that unravel the elaborate tapestry of lies. She recalled Mr. Thorne's initial conversation with Mrs. Elms, as recounted to her, where he had spoken of being tired of city life and seeking rural peace. It was a generic, almost cliched explanation, precisely the kind a man might offer, if he wished to appear unremarkable, to fit a preconceived notion without revealing anything of substance. Inspector Craddock, now facing a far more complex case, expanded his inquiries. He returned to the local antique shop, Mr. Hemmings's Emporium, where Miss Marple had observed Mr. Thorne lingering. Mr. Hemmings, a man with a memory as sharp as his spectacles, recalled the mysterious lodger with surprising clarity. "Oh, yes," Mr. Thorne Hemmings recounted, stroking his neatly trimmed beard. "A curious fellow, always looking, never buying. But he had a particular fascination for our local maps, especially the older ones. He'd spent ages just peering at them, tracing paths with his finger. Never bought one, mind you, always put them back exactly as he found them." He paused, a thoughtful frown on his face. "I specifically remember him examining a rather rare, hand-drawn map of the immediate area. Around here, dating back, 50 years or more. A peculiar thing, showing all the old field boundaries, even a few long-gone footpaths. He seemed quite taken with it. This detail resonated with Miss Marple. The library card applied for, but never used to borrow books, now seemed less about reading and more about access. Access to reference materials, perhaps, or to a quiet place where he could study a map unnoticed. The open window, the lack of mail, his solitary habits, they all pointed to a man who was meticulously focused on a single, secret objective. The inspector's men conducted another, far more rigorous search of Lilac Cottage. This time they found a small, almost microscopic tear in the lining of one of the empty suitcases, as if something had been carefully prized from it, or perhaps tucked into it. They also found a faint outline on the back of the dark leather-bound book Mr. Thorne always carried, as if a thin, rectangular object had been repeatedly pressed against its cover. But these were mere suggestions, not concrete evidence. The strain of the investigation began to tell on Mrs. Elms. She fretted constantly about her missing brooch, the theft of which now seemed far more sinister in light of Thorne's true identity. Could the thief also be a murderer? Her imagination, once placid, now ran wild with possibilities. Miss Marple, however, returned to her knitting, her mind working through the threads. A man seeking old maps, concealing his identity, and suddenly vanishing. It was not a tale of a lovesick runaway or a defaulting debtor. It was the story of a deliberate, calculating search. But for what? That evening a thought struck Miss Marple with the force of a small, precise revelation. She walked to the village library, its lights now out, its doors locked. She recalled Mr. Hemmings's description of the old map and Miss Prescott's observation that Mr. Thorne had never borrowed a book. But had he simply looked at books within the library? Miss Marple had seen him near the local history section. With a sudden certainty, she resolved to return to the library first thing in the morning. She had a particular book in mind, one that contained rare local maps, and she had a premonition about a certain type of bookmark. The next morning, true to her resolve, Miss Marple presented herself at the library. "Miss Prescott," she inquired. "Gently, I wonder if you might help me. I am looking for the large volume on the history of St. Mary Mead and its environs, the one with the particularly detailed, hand-drawn maps of the old estates." Miss Prescott, always eager to assist, led her directly to it. The book was indeed there, recently returned, and nestled between two pages, marking a section detailing the historical ownership of land around Lilac Cottage, was a small, pressed, dried flower, a unique, almost translucent hellebore, a species not commonly found in English gardens save for one very specific, carefully tended patch in St. Mary Mead, a patch in Mrs. Elms's own garden. Chapter 7. The Unmarked Grave and the Pressed Flower. The pressed hellebore, so delicately preserved within the pages of the local history book, spoke volumes to Miss Marple. She recognized it instantly, not merely as a hellebore, but as a specific variety, Helleborus orientalis, Mrs. Elms's delight. Cultivated with great pride by Mrs. Elms herself, a unique hybrid she had nurtured for years in a secluded corner of her garden. The likelihood of Mr. Thorne carrying such a specific bloom as a bookmark, one clearly taken from Mrs. Elms's property, was not a coincidence. It was a pointer, a deliberate, albeit subtle, connection. Miss Marple made her way to Lilac Cottage, not directly to Mrs. Elms, but to her garden. She observed the hellebore patch. A few blooms were indeed missing, their stems cleanly snipped. Mrs. Elms, tending to her runner beans, looked up, a weary smile on her face. "Oh, Miss Marple, you're just in time for a cup of tea. This business with Mr. Thorne, it's quite put me off my stride." "Indeed, dear Mrs. Elms, a most unsettling affair." Miss Marple gestured towards the hellebores. "Your beautiful hellebores are coming along splendidly. You have such a green thumb." Mrs. Elms brightened, a rare moment of pleasure amidst her worries. "Oh, thank you, Miss Marple. They are my pride and joy." Though she paused, a slight frown touching her brow, "I did notice a few went missing a few weeks back. Thought it was a child, perhaps, or a deer. And that patch there, near the old apple tree?" Miss Marple inquired, pointing to a small, slightly disturbed area of earth, partially overgrown with ivy, where the ground sloped gently down towards a low, crumbling stone wall. "It seems a little different." Mrs. Elms peered at it. "Oh, that. Yes, I meant to dig that over. I did notice a funny-looking flower there, a bit like a wild hellebore, but not one of mine. It had quite a strong scent. I was sure I had seen it there a few weeks ago, but when I went back to look, it was gone." She shrugged. "Probably my imagination. What with all the worry." Miss Marple's mind was racing. A specific flower, a slightly disturbed patch of earth, a strong scent, and the missing brooch still unaccounted for. She now saw a pattern emerging, clearer than ever. Mr. Thorne had been systematically searching. For what? The old map, the history book, the hellebore taken from the garden, the disturbed earth, the stolen brooch. Each piece of the puzzle spoke of a deliberate, focused quest. He wasn't merely a lodger, or even just an impostor. He was a seeker, a hunter, and Lilac Cottage Wash's hunting ground. The inspector's team had found nothing further in their extensive searches. They were now broadening their inquiry, sending telegrams to other constabularies, trying to ascertain the true identity of the man calling himself Julian Thorne. They were looking for a person, but Miss Marple suspected they should be looking for a purpose. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sought out young Timothy, the vicar's gardener's boy, a sturdy, adventurous lad with a healthy curiosity. "Timothy, my dear," she began, her voice gentle, "I wonder if you might do an old lady a small favor. Do you think you might, perhaps quietly and very carefully, do a little digging for me? Near the old apple tree in Mrs. Elms's garden, just by that crumbling wall. I seem to have misplaced a rather sentimental gardening token there, and my old back isn't what it used to be." Timothy, always eager for a bit of adventure, and fond of Miss Marple's occasional tips, nodded enthusiastically. "Of course, Miss Marple, I'll be as quiet as a mouse." Miss Marple watched from her window as Timothy, armed with a small spade, made his way to Lilac Cottage. He moved stealthily, disappearing behind the hellebore patch. A quarter of an hour later he re-emerged, a look of wide-eyed wonder on his face. He held something small and rectangular, covered in earth, which he carefully carried towards Miss Marple's gate. It was a weathered wooden box, no bigger than a shoebox, its surface darkened with age and moisture, its edges softened by time. It was not, Miss Marple knew instinctively, a gardening token, and the unmarked grave in Mrs. Elms's garden had just yielded its first secret. Chapter 8. The Box's Contents and a Ghost of the Past. Timothy, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of discovery, presented the wooden box to Miss Marple. It was heavy, and its old latch, rusted shut, yielded with a protesting squeak when Miss Marple carefully prized it open with a small gardening tool. Inside, nestled amongst layers of damp, decaying cloth, lay a collection of relics from a bygone era. There were old letters, their paper brittle and yellowed, tied with faded silk ribbon. A delicate silver locket, tarnished with age, lay beside, them containing a faded photograph of a young woman with a determined gaze and hair piled high in the fashion of a previous generation. And then the most significant find, a sheaf of legal documents crisp despite their age, bound with an official-looking red seal. Among them was a meticulously hand-drawn deed for Lilac Cottage itself, dated over 50 years prior. Miss Marple carefully unfolded the deed. It detailed the ownership of the property not in the name of Mrs. Elms's late husband's family, who had inherited it through a more recent line, but in the name of a Miss Elspeth Thorne, the very same surname as their mysterious lodger. The letters, when Miss Marple later read them in the quiet solitude of her study, spoke of a secret love, a forbidden marriage, and a subsequent disinheritance. Elspeth Thorne had defied her family's wishes, marrying a man deemed unsuitable, and had been cut off from her inheritance, which included Lilac Cottage. The letters, passionate and defiant, hinted at a struggle, a fight for recognition, and rightful ownership that had, apparently, failed. There were references to a hidden truth and the missing paper. The locket, too, confirmed her suspicions. The faded photograph within was a younger, clearer image of the face on the half-burnt scrap Mrs. Elms had found in the grate. It was Elspeth Thorne. The pieces were falling into place with a chilling precision. Miss Marple now understood. Mr. Julian Thorne had not been a random lodger, nor a mere thief, nor a victim of foul play. He had been a descendant of Elspeth Thorne, a man on a quest to reclaim a lost inheritance. Lilac Cottage was not just a dwelling, it was a key to a forgotten past, a repository of secrets that had laid dormant for half a century. His sparse luggage, the unread books, the library visits, the intense study of old maps, all were now revealed as the methodical preparations of a man researching a claim. The open window, perhaps to air a room he was painstakingly searching, or simply a ruse to provide an easy exit if needed. The missing brooch, it was not stolen for its intrinsic value, but for something it contained, something vital to his quest. Mrs. Elms's sentimental gardening token had been the final crucial find, the revelation that Mr. Thorne was a descendant of the original. Owner Elspeth Thorne shifted the entire narrative. He wasn't looking for a treasure in the conventional sense, but for documentary proof, a legal claim that would restore his family's rightful ownership of the property. He had rented the room under a false identity to search for this proof undisturbed, living a life of careful inconspicuousness. Miss Marple held the old deed in her hands, her mind now clear. The true target of the mysterious lodger was not the lodger himself, nor a simple theft. It was Lilac Cottage itself, or rather, the hidden history it contained. Julian Thorne had come to the village not to disappear, but to unearth a ghost of the past, and to reclaim what he believed was his. His disappearance was not a mystery of death, but of triumphant, calculated evasion. He had found what he was looking for, and he had escaped with it. The question now was, what exactly had he found that enabled him to disappear so abruptly? And what specific item would give him the legal standing to press his claim? The old letters hinted at a missing paper, a hidden truth. Miss Marple looked at the locket, then back at the deed. It was a tangible link, but perhaps not enough. There had to be one last piece, a definitive proof, and Miss Marple had a growing suspicion as to where it might have been concealed, a place that the current owners would never have thought to look. Chapter 9. The Truth in Quiet Corners. Miss Marple, her mind having meticulously pieced together the puzzle, arranged a quiet gathering in Mrs. Elms's parlor. Present were Mrs. Elms herself, still pale with worry, but now tinged with a bewildered curiosity, P.C. Hemlock, and Inspector Craddock, who, despite his professional skepticism, had learned to respect Miss Marple's uncanny insights. The wooden box and its contents, the old letters, the locket, and the original deed for Lilac Cottage lay open on the coffee table, silent witnesses to a long-forgotten family drama. "Inspector, Mrs. Elms, Constable," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but imbued with an undeniable authority. "The mystery of Mr. Julian Thorne's disappearance, I believe, is now quite clear. Mr. Thorne was not a victim, nor was he simply a man, fleeing a shadowed past. He was, in fact, a man seeking to right an old wrong." She explained that Julian Thorne was a descendant of Elspeth Thorne, the original owner of Lilac Cottage, who had been disinherited some 50 years prior due to a scandalous marriage. He came to St. Mary Mead not as a casual lodger, but as a genealogist and claimant under a false name to investigate his family's lost inheritance. He was searching for proof, for a hidden document that would validate his claim to this very house. Miss Marple then detailed the subtle clues, his interest in local maps, the hellebore bookmark from Mrs. Elm's garden, found in the history book, the disturbed earth near the apple tree where the box was unearthed. He meticulously researched his family's history, and with great patience he located the original deed for Lilac Cottage, buried in your garden, Mrs. Elms, where Elspeth Thorne had secreted it along with her letters, perhaps as a desperate act to ensure her truth was eventually found. But the deed and the letters, Miss Marple clarified, were not quite enough. The missing paper mentioned in Elspeth's correspondence still needed to be found, and that, I believe, leads us to Mrs. Elms's missing brooch. Mrs. Elms gasped, her eyes wide. "My amethyst brooch?" "Indeed," Miss Marple confirmed. "The brooch, valuable though it is, was not stolen for its gems, but for what it concealed." Many such sentimental pieces from that era had hidden compartments, often used for a lock of hair or a miniature portrait. In this case, I suspect, it held a codicil, a small vital amendment to a will, or perhaps a final letter from Elspeth, clarifying the terms of her inheritance or appointing a true heir. Inspector Craddock leaned forward. "And you believe Thorne found this codicil in the brooch, and then simply left?" "Precisely, Inspector. His disappearance was not a vanishing act of a man in trouble, but of a man victorious. He acquired the final piece of evidence he needed, and then, rather cleverly, manufactured his own disappearance to escape with it, hoping that the village would focus on the mystery of his person rather than the true purpose of his visit." Miss Marple then addressed the lingering questions. The stain on the rug, Constable Hemlock, was not tea or ink. The faint metallic scent I detected, I now believe, was a chemical used in developing old photographs, or perhaps for revealing hidden ink on aged paper or maps. He was clearly trying to make something illegible or deliberately obscured visible again. And the half-burnt photograph, Mrs. Elms, was undoubtedly a picture of Elspeth Thorne, perhaps used by Julian to confirm her identity or a specific location. He disposed of it once its purpose was served. The inspector rubbed his chin. A fascinating theory, Miss Marple. But how do we prove he left with this codicil? And where would he go? Miss Marple smiled gently. Sometimes, Inspector, the most obscure details prove to be the most revealing. Among Elspeth's letters in the box, there is a recurring reference to a specific, rather rare stamp, one she always placed on the back of letters sent to her beloved, an old family eccentricity. I recall a gentleman from the next village, Mr. Peterson, a renowned philatelist, who collects such unusual stamps. He might remember an unusual inquiry about such stamps, or even a specific letter. The inspector's eyes lit up. A stamp collector? A long shot, but worth pursuing. Indeed, Miss Marple replied, her gaze thoughtful. It is in these quiet corners of forgotten detail that the truth often resides. Julian Thorne, you see, was so meticulous in creating his new identity, he forgot that a ghost from the past might still leave a very physical, very tangible mark. The last piece of the puzzle, a tiny, colorful rectangle, had just clicked into place. Chapter 10. The last piece of the puzzle. The lead provided by Miss Marple, though seemingly an old maid's whimsy, proved remarkably fruitful. Inspector Craddock dispatched a plainclothes officer to interview Mr. Peterson, the renowned philatelist in the neighboring village. The old gentleman, a stickler for detail, immediately recalled a rather insistent inquiry he had received a few weeks prior from a polite but somewhat secretive man. Matching Mr. Thorne's description, who had a peculiar interest in the very specific, rare stamp Miss Marple had described, the man, who had introduced himself as Mr. J. Thistle, had been particularly keen to know if Mr. Peterson had ever come across any old letters bearing that specific stamp, especially if they were addressed to a Miss Elspeth Thorne. This contact provided the inspector with the true identity of Julian Thorne, a distant descendant named Jeremy Thorpe, a rather obscure genealogist with a reputation for tenacity. He had been located in London in the process of consulting with a solicitor regarding a historic property claim. Confronted with the evidence, Thorpe confessed his scheme. He had indeed discovered his family's disinheritance through his genealogical research and had meticulously planned his infiltration of Lilac Cottage. He had rented the room under a false name, not to commit a violent crime, but to discreetly search for the lost codicil that would restore his family's claim to the property. The old maps, the library visits, the digging in the garden, and finally the meticulous search of Mrs. Elms's possessions for the heirloom brooch, which he knew, from family lore, sometimes contained a hidden compartment. The codicil, a small folded piece of parchment, had indeed been found within the brooch, stating Elspeth's true wishes and naming her direct descendants as the rightful heirs to Lilac Cottage. His staged disappearance had been a calculated risk designed to buy him time to escape with the vital document and begin legal proceedings before Mrs. Elms could fully comprehend what had transpired. He had assumed the villagers would focus on his vanishing, not the real reasons for his presence. The news, when it finally reached St. Mary Mead, caused less a scandal than a deep collective sigh of astonishment. Mrs. Elms, initially heartbroken by the deception, found herself caught in a complex legal dispute, but the brooch, with its secret compartment now empty but its amethyst gleaming, was returned to her. The weight of worry finally lifted. She felt a strange mix of relief and melancholy, as if a long-dormant ghost had finally been laid to rest. Miss Marple, observing the gentle return to normalcy, found herself reflecting on the deeper currents of human nature. "It is remarkable, is it not, Cherry," she mused to her maid, "how the roots of family secrets can lie buried for generations. only to resurface with such quiet determination. Greed, of course, plays its part, but also a sense of historical justice, twisted though it may be. The village, for a time, would have a new story to tell, a new chapter added to its long, placid history. And in the quiet understanding of Miss Marple, the faint, unidentifiable discord she had felt upon Mr. Thorne's arrival had been fully resolved, harmonized by the clear, precise melody of truth. The last lodger had indeed left his indelible mark, not with violence, but with a cunning born of deep-seated purpose. Thank you for watching this story. We hope you enjoyed delving into the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead and solving the mystery with Miss Marple. Do join us next time for another tale of intrigue and human folly,